"It's my hair," he said. "It has never been cut, not since the day I was born. My strength and power come from the gods, and they reside in my locks. If these locks are ever cut, I will lose everything." Bediako and Munumkum, along with a small group of loyal followers, journeyed deep into the wilderness, far from the reach of Nana Koduah and his allies. There, surrounded by dense forests and fertile land, Bediako founded a village he named Asomdwe, Peace Village. The name symbolized his vision of a haven where no man, woman, or child would be bound by chains, a sanctuary for those seeking freedom from tyranny and oppression. Asomdwe quickly became a beacon of hope for many. Bediako, with his unmatched strength and unyielding sense of justice, made it his mission to fight against the cruel practices of Nana Koduah and the Portuguese slave traders. He ventured into enemy territory, ambushing caravans of captured men, women and children, destined for a life of misery. With each victory, he freed dozens of captives, offering them a place in his village where they could rebuild their lives in peace and dignity. Some of the captives Bediako rescued were warriors, others were farmers, traders, and even children who had been torn from their families. They came to Asomdwe seeking refuge, their gratitude for Bediako immeasurable. Among them were storytellers and artisans who brought culture and life to the growing community. "Here," Bediako would say to them, "you are no longer slaves. You are free men and women, and this land is your home." Word of Asomdwe spread like wildfire across the neighboring kingdoms. It was said that Bediako's village was a place of safety, where the gods themselves protected the weak. Those who managed to escape from Nana Koduah's prisons or the clutches of Portuguese slave traders made their way through dangerous forests and treacherous rivers to reach this sanctuary. In time, Asomdwe became more than just a refuge. It was a thriving village of resilience and hope. The men and women who settled there worked together to build homes, farm the fertile lands, and craft tools and weapons. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the air, a stark contrast to the cries of despair they had once known in captivity. Elders from different tribes brought their wisdom, helping to create a community that honored diverse traditions while uniting under a shared purpose. Bediako's leadership was revered, and his name became legendary, whispered in awe across the region. "Bediako," they would say, "the man who defies kings and protects the oppressed. He is not just a warrior, he is a savior." Despite its growing reputation, Asomdwe was not without its challenges. Nana Koduah, enraged by Bediako's defiance, intensified his efforts to crush him. He sent spies to locate the village and sabotage its peace. But Bediako's vigilance and the loyalty of his people thwarted every attempt. Warriors in the village, many of whom were once captives, trained under Bediako's guidance, becoming a formidable force prepared to defend their sanctuary. Munumkum, who had followed Bediako to Asomdwe, continued to play her part. She pretended to support his mission, working alongside him to care for the rescued captives and build the village's infrastructure. But in her heart, her loyalty remained divided. She still harbored ambitions to deliver Bediako to Nana Koduah, though she concealed her intentions with masterful deceit. Though the village thrived, Bediako remained cautious. He knew that Nana Koduah and the Portuguese would not sit idly by while he continued to disrupt their trade and defy their power. He prepared for the day when they would come for him, sharpening his mind and strengthening his people. Little did he know betrayal was closer than he realized. Munumkum, ever calculating, bided her time, waiting for the perfect moment to act. She watched Bediako closely, pretending to love and support him, all the while keeping track of his strengths and weaknesses. Her cunning heart saw Asomdwe Kuro not as a home, but as an opportunity to deliver Bediako to Nana Koduah and fulfill her family's ambitions. As the Portuguese observed the growing power of Nana Koduah and his allied kingdoms, they began to grow uneasy. With the steady supply of enslaved men, women and children from these territories, Nana Koduah's forces had become a formidable force in the region. The Portuguese realized that the balance of power was shifting dangerously in Nana Koduah's favor, and they feared losing control over him. In response, the Portuguese devised a cunning plan. They began secretly arming the weaker kingdoms neighboring Nana Koduah's domain, supplying them with powerful weapons, muskets, cannons, and ammunition. Their goal was to destabilize Nana Koduah's power by encouraging prolonged warfare between him and the weaker kingdoms. They hoped these smaller kingdoms would capture warriors, men, women and children during the battles, providing the Portuguese with fresh slaves to fuel their trade. The weak kingdoms, emboldened by the Portuguese support, wasted no time in launching attacks against Nana Koduah and his allies. Skirmishes erupted along the borders, and villages were raided in the dead of night. Entire communities were destroyed, and the survivors were either taken captive or forced to flee to safer lands, such as Bediako's Asomdwe Kuro. The region descended into chaos as the wars escalated, filling the forests with the cries of the captured and the smouldering remains of once thriving villages. Nana Koduah, though powerful, found himself overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies and the sophisticated weapons now wielded by the weaker kingdoms. His warriors, accustomed to dominating the battlefield, began to falter under the relentless assaults. For the first time, Nana Koduah's grip on the region seemed to weaken, and he grew desperate to understand how his enemies had gained such strength. Realizing that something was amiss, Nana Koduah demanded an audience with the Portuguese traders who had long been his allies. The meeting took place at the edge of his palace, under the blazing sun, with his warriors standing guard. The Portuguese governor, accompanied by a few of his men, arrived with a smug air, their confidence betraying their hidden agenda. Nana Koduah, his face dark with anger, wasted no time. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "You have armed my enemies, given them the tools to wage war against me and my people. Do you take me for a fool?" The Portuguese governor feigned innocence, spreading his hands in mock surrender. "Nana Koduah, we are merely traders. We deal in goods, weapons, and slaves. If your enemies have acquired weapons, it is because they are also our partners. Trade is trade." "Trade?" Nana Koduah roared, stepping closer to the governor. "You betray me after all I have done for you. I have delivered men, women and children into your hands. I have fought battles on your behalf, and this is how you repay me." The governor's smug expression faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Nana Koduah," he said, his tone calm but firm, "this is not betrayal, it is justice. The troubles caused by Bediako have disrupted our business. Your failure to deal with him has made us reconsider our alliances." Nana Koduah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Bediako," he spat, "you blame me for his actions? I have hunted him relentlessly, yet you arm my enemies to punish me for not capturing him?" The governor shrugged. "Bediako's actions have cost us dearly. He has freed captives, disrupted trade routes, and inspired resistance among the enslaved. Your failure to control him has made you a liability. The weaker kingdoms, with our support, will balance the scales. Nana Koduah's fury boiled over, but he knew better than to strike the governor. The Portuguese were too powerful, their ships and soldiers beyond his reach. Instead, he clenched his fists and snarled, "This is a dangerous game you play, governor. You forget that my kingdom is the strongest in the region. When I regain my strength, you will regret your betrayal." The governor smiled coldly. "Perhaps, but for now, Nana Koduah, we suggest you focus on dealing with your enemies. The trade must continue, one way or another." With that, the Portuguese left, leaving Nana Koduah seething with rage and humiliation. He returned to his palace, gathering his advisors and plotting his next move. The betrayal of the Portuguese had shaken him to his core, but he vowed to reclaim his dominance, even if it meant waging war against every neighboring kingdom. Meanwhile, the turmoil in the region only grew. Asomjwe Kuro continued to grow, becoming a sanctuary for those fleeing the violence. Bediako's name became even more legendary as he rescued captives and stood against the forces of tyranny. The weakened kingdoms, despite their newfound strength, began to fear Bediako more than Nana Koduah. For Nana Koduah, the pressure mounted. He faced enemies on all sides, weak kingdoms emboldened by the Portuguese, his own disillusioned people, and the ever-looming threat of Bediako, whose influence only seemed to grow. The region teetered on the brink of an even greater conflict, one that would determine the fate of Nana Koduah, Bediako, and the entire land. It was a night of celebration in Asomjwe Kuro. Bediako and his people gathered around a massive fire, their laughter and songs echoing through the tranquil forest. They celebrated their victories against Nana Koduah and the Portuguese, their spirits high after yet another successful rescue mission. The villagers sang praises to Bediako, calling him their savior, their lion in human form. Children danced, women served freshly prepared meals, and the men toasted to the strength and resilience of their leader. Amid the joyous atmosphere, Ya Munumkum saw an opportunity. She had been biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to uncover the source of Bediako's extraordinary power. With a charming smile, she approached him, carrying a calabash filled with palm wine. "Bediako," she said sweetly, sitting beside him, "tonight is a night to celebrate. You have done so much for us. Let me serve you as you have served this village." Bediako, already in high spirits, accepted the wine with gratitude. "Thank you, Munumkum," he said, raising the calabash, "to victory and freedom." As the night wore on, Bediako drank more than usual, his laughter growing louder, his movements more relaxed. Munumkum stayed by his side, pouring wine whenever his calabash emptied, her cunning plan inching closer to fruition. When she saw that his guard was down, she leaned closer and whispered, "Bediako, I have always wondered, what makes you so powerful? How is it that no sword, no gun, no enemy can defeat you?" Bediako chuckled, his smile wide. "Munumkum," he said, his voice slightly slurred. "You of all people should know. Isn't it obvious?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "No, I don't know. Please tell me." Bediako laughed again, stroking his long dreadlocks. "It's my hair," he said. "It has never been cut, not since the day I was born. My strength and power come from the gods, and they reside in my locks. If these locks are ever cut, I will lose everything." Munumkum's eyes widened, her heart racing with a mix of shock and excitement. At last, she had discovered the secret. She masked her emotions, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's incredible," she said, her voice soft. "You are truly blessed." 2 weeks had passed since the grand celebration in Asomjwe Kuro. The village had returned to its peaceful rhythm, with Bediako's people going about their daily activities. Yet the echoes of that night still lingered in Bediako's mind. 2 weeks later, a young scout arrived in the village, his face pale and his breath short. He had travelled far and fast, carrying urgent news. He found Bediako at the village square, speaking with the elders about future defences for Asomjwe Kuro. "Bediako!" the scout called, his voice urgent. "The Portuguese are leading thousands of captives to their slave camp. They're moving through the forest near the southern borders." The square fell silent as everyone turned to listen. Bediako's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "How many soldiers are guarding them?" he asked. "A large force," the scout replied. "Larger than anything we've seen before. They are heavily armed with guns, swords and cannons. It seems they are preparing for an attack as well." Bediako nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I will go alone," he said firmly. The elders exchanged worried glances. One of them spoke. "Bediako, let us send warriors with you this time. The Portuguese forces are too great. You cannot face them alone." But Bediako shook his head. "I fight alone. I will not risk the lives of my people. This is my mission, and I will see it through." Bediako set off that same day, his dreadlocks tied back, his bow and quiver of arrows strapped to his back, and his sword at his side. The forest was dense and dark, but he moved through it with the ease of a predator stalking its prey. As he neared the southern borders, he could hear the distant cries of captives and the clinking of chains. The sight before him fueled his anger. A long caravan of captives, men, women and children, marched under the cruel watch of Portuguese soldiers. The soldiers were armed to the teeth, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. Bediako crouched in the shadows, observing their movements. He counted the soldiers, well over 100, all heavily armed, their leader riding on horseback barking orders. The captives, weary and shackled, stumbled as they marched, their faces filled with despair. As the caravan reached a clearing, Bediako stepped out from the shadows, his towering figure illuminated by the moonlight. He roared like a lion, his voice echoing through the forest. The soldiers froze, turning to see the lone warrior standing fearlessly before them. "It's him!" one of them shouted. "The Lion of Asomjwe Kuro!" Bediako wasted no time. With lightning speed, he drew his bow and fired a volley of arrows. Each arrow found its mark, felling soldiers before they could react. The Portuguese opened fire, but their bullets ricocheted off Bediako's skin as if it were bulletproof. "He's invincible!" one soldier cried in terror. Bediako charged toward them, his movements fluid and swift. With his fists, he struck down one soldier after another, his blows powerful enough to shatter bones. A soldier swung his sword at him, but it broke upon contact with his skin, leaving the man defenseless. Bediako grabbed the shattered blade and used it as a weapon, cutting through the enemy ranks like a whirlwind. The captives, who had heard tales of Bediako's bravery, began cheering. "Bediako! Bediako! Save us!" Their voices rang out, filling the air with hope. Those who recognized him wept with relief, knowing they were in the presence of the warrior who had defied kings and empires. The Portuguese, realizing their guns were useless, tried to overwhelm him with numbers. Bediako, undeterred, moved like a shadow, disappearing into the forest and reappearing behind his enemies. He leapt into the air, kicking one soldier so hard that he flew into a group of his comrades, knocking them all to the ground. His fists struck with the force of a hammer. His legs swept through soldiers like a scythe through grass. One soldier, desperate to stop him, fired a cannon. The explosion echoed through the forest. But when the smoke cleared, Bediako stood unscathed. His eyes burned with fury as he charged toward the cannon operator, disarming him and using the cannon itself as a battering ram to crush the enemy line. The forest became a battlefield of chaos and blood.
Yeah!
Bediako's roars filled the air as he fought like a man possessed. Swords clashed, arrows flew, and bodies fell, but Bediako remained untouchable, his strength fueled by the cries of the captives cheering his name. When the battle finally ended, over 100 Portuguese soldiers lay dead, their weapons scattered across the clearing. Only one survived, trembling as he knelt before Bediako, their faces pale with fear. "Go!" Bediako commanded, his voice cold and unyielding. "Tell your masters this: the gods are with me. Your tyranny will end, and your empire will crumble. Let Nana Koduah know that his days are numbered." The soldiers fled, leaving behind the captives and their weapons. Bediako turned to the freed captives, his voice softening. "You are free now," he said. "Come with me to Asomjwe Kuro. There you will find peace." The captives, their chains broken, wept with gratitude. They followed Bediako through the forest, their hearts filled with hope and admiration for the warrior who had saved them. But as Bediako led them back to his village, his thoughts lingered on Munumkum. He had entrusted her with his heart, and now his secret. Little did he know, the greatest battle was yet to come, not against soldiers or kings, but against betrayal closer than he could imagine. The Portuguese governor sat in his grand chamber, surrounded by his advisors, when the surviving soldiers returned with the report of their devastating defeat. The governor listened intently as they described the carnage, how Bediako had single-handedly annihilated their forces, destroyed their weapons, and freed the captives. "What?" the governor roared, slamming his fist on the table, his face flushed with rage, and his voice echoed through the room. "How dare he? How dare one man defy us, kill my soldiers, and disrupt my business?" He rose to his feet, pacing the room like a caged lion. "I want him alive," he declared, his tone venomous. "Whoever brings Bediako to me will be rewarded handsomely. Gold, land, whatever they desire. But when I have him, he will regret the day he was born. I will make an example of him so brutal that no one will ever dare stand against me again." The room fell silent as his advisors nodded in agreement. Word of the governor's bounty on Bediako's head spread quickly, reaching even the farthest corners of the region. Meanwhile, Nana Koduah's frustration with his inability to capture Bediako grew. He had relied on Munumkum's family in Nyamikrom to deliver Bediako to him, but their failure had only brought him shame. Seeing the Portuguese governor's growing anger and hearing of the bounty placed on Bediako, Nana Koduah decided to act swiftly and ruthlessly. He gathered his warriors and launched a surprise attack on Nyamikrom. The village, unprepared for such an assault, was quickly overrun. Men, women and children were dragged from their homes, screaming and pleading for mercy. "This is your punishment for defying me!" Nana Koduah bellowed as his warriors bound the captives. "You were entrusted to bring me Bediako, and you failed. Now you will pay the price." Among the captives were several members of Munumkum's extended family, including elders and children. The devastation left the once thriving village in ruins, with only a few managing to escape the carnage. When Munumkum heard the news of Nana Koduah's attack on her family's village, a storm of emotions swept through her. She felt a pang of guilt, knowing that her failure to deliver Bediako had led to this. But guilt quickly gave way to ambition as she learned of the Portuguese governor's bounty on Bediako. "This is my chance," she thought, her mind racing. If I capture Bediako, not only will I save my family, but I will also gain favor with Nana Koduah and the Portuguese. I will rise in status, be showered with rewards, and become untouchable. But Munumkum knew it wouldn't be easy. Bediako was strong, nearly invincible, and deeply loved by his people. To betray him would require cunning and a plan so perfect that no one would suspect her involvement. She recalled the secret Bediako had shared during the celebration, that his power resided in his dreadlocks. If she could cut them off, he would be powerless, vulnerable. The thought sent a chill through her, but she steeled herself. "I must do this," she whispered to herself, "for my family, for my future." Munumkum began to devise her plan carefully. She acted as if nothing was amiss, continuing to show unwavering love and support for Bediako. She accompanied him on his daily rounds in the village, helping to care for the rescued captives and offering words of encouragement to his people. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, she leaned against him and said, "Bediako, you've done so much for this village, for these people, but sometimes I worry about you. You never seem to rest." Bediako smiled, his trust in her unwavering. "The gods give me strength, Munumkum. As long as I have their favor, I have nothing to fear." She nodded, her heart pounding as she thought of the betrayal she was planning. "Of course," she said softly, "you are truly blessed." In secret, Munumkum began gathering the tools she would need to cut Bediako's dreadlocks. She sharpened a blade and hid it beneath her belongings, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She knew she would have to act quickly, for if Bediako suspected her intentions, he would never forgive her. Munumkum had carefully planned her betrayal. In secret, she sent a trusted spy to the Portuguese camp, carrying a message for the governor. The spy relayed Munumkum's plan, informing the Portuguese to remain on standby as she prepared to hand Bediako over to them. "Once his dreadlocks are cut," the spy told them, "he will be powerless. I will send word when it's time for you to capture him." The Portuguese governor, still seething from Bediako's repeated disruptions, was thrilled. He gathered his soldiers and allied black warriors, instructing them to remain ready for the signal from Munumkum. "This time," he said coldly, "Bediako will not escape. The lion of Asomjwe Kuro will become nothing more than a caged beast." Munumkum decided to put her plans into action. One evening she approached Bediako with a wide smile and sparkling eyes. "Bediako," she said sweetly, "I have wonderful news, news worth celebrating." Bediako, seeing her radiant expression, couldn't contain his curiosity. "What is it, Munumkum?" he asked eagerly. She took his hands in hers, her voice soft and joyful. "I am pregnant." The words struck Bediako like a bolt of lightning, but this time it wasn't the gods speaking. It was joy. His face lit up, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Munumkum, this is the best news I've ever received. The gods have truly blessed us." Munumkum's heart raced, not from joy, but from the anticipation of her plan. She knew this moment of happiness would make Bediako drop his guard completely. "This calls for a celebration," she said, pouring him a generous cup of palm wine. "Tonight, let's drink to our future." As the evening progressed, Bediako drank deeply, his excitement overshadowing his usual caution. The villagers celebrated alongside him, sharing in his joy. Munumkum stayed by his side, refilling his cup every time it emptied. By the time the celebration ended, Bediako was heavily drunk, his movements unsteady and his words slurred. Munumkum guided him to their hut, her heart pounding as the final phase of her plan unfolded. "Rest, my love," she whispered, helping him lie down. "Tonight is a night to remember." Bediako smiled weakly, his trust in her absolute. As he drifted into a deep sleep, Munumkum sat beside him, watching him for a moment. Despite her growing guilt, the promise of wealth, status, and her family's safety hardened her resolve. She reached beneath her belongings and retrieved the sharp blade she had hidden days earlier. Carefully, she moved toward Bediako, her hands trembling slightly as she touched his thick, matted dreadlocks, the source of his power. With one decisive motion, she began cutting. The blade sliced through the locks, the heavy strands falling to the floor one by one. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. When the final lock was cut, she stood back, staring at the lifeless heap of hair at her feet. "It's done," she whispered, her voice hollow. Munumkum wasted no time. She summoned her spies and sent them to the Portuguese camp with the news. "Tell them Bediako is powerless and weak," she instructed. "He is asleep in his hut, and he cannot defend himself." This is their moment. The spies hurried to the camp, where the Portuguese governor eagerly received the message. He rallied his soldiers and allied black warriors, assembling a formidable force to march on Asomdwe Kuro. Fully armed with muskets, swords and chains, the group set out under the cover of darkness, their torches lighting the way. Meanwhile, Munumkum quietly left the village. She made her way back to her family's settlement, unwilling to face the consequences of her betrayal when Bediako's people discovered what she had done. As she walked, her heart was heavy, but she convinced herself it was necessary. "This is for my family," she murmured, "and for a future where I will never fear." Late that night, the Portuguese soldiers arrived at Asomdwe Kuro. The village was silent, its people fast asleep, unaware of the danger creeping toward them. The soldiers surrounded Bediako's hut, their weapons drawn. Inside, Bediako lay on his mat, still asleep, the effects of the alcohol and the absence of his dreadlocks rendering him defenseless. The soldiers stormed in, grasping Bediako by the arms and legs. He woke with a start, confused and disoriented. "What is this?" he shouted, struggling against their grip. But his strength was gone, his movement sluggish. For the first time in his life, he felt weak. The soldiers laughed as they bound him with heavy chains. "So, this is the mighty Bediako," one sneered. "Not so powerful now, are you?" Realizing what had happened, Bediako's heart sank. He looked around the hut, noticing the absence of his dreadlocks. His eyes burned with rage and betrayal as the truth hit him. "Munumkum," he growled. "She did this." Despite his weakened state, Bediako fought back with everything he had. He lashed out with his fists, kicking and thrashing, but the soldiers outnumbered him. One struck him across the head with the butt of a musket, dazing him further. They dragged him out of the hut, their torches illuminating his struggling figure. The commotion woke the villagers, who emerged from their homes in shock and horror. "Bediako!" they cried, watching helplessly as their leader was taken away. Some tried to intervene, but the armed soldiers threatened them, forcing them to stand down. Bediako, bloodied and exhausted, looked back at his people. "Do not give up," he called to them, his voice filled with defiance. "The gods are still with us. This is not the end." The captives cheered for him, even in their despair, their faith in Bediako unshaken. The soldiers dragged him through the forest toward the Portuguese camp, his shouts of resistance fading into the night. The morning after the betrayal, the people of Asomdwe Kuro gathered in the village square, their faces etched with grief and anger. They found the remnants of Bediako's dreadlocks scattered on the floor of his hut, a chilling reminder of the treachery that had befallen him. "How could this happen?" one elder asked, his voice trembling. "Who among us betrayed him?" Whispers of Munumkum's sudden disappearance began to spread. Suspicion grew, and the villagers realized that the woman Bediako had loved and trusted had been the architect of his downfall. In the Portuguese camp, Bediako's chains clinked as he was thrown into a dark cell. The governor stood before him, a satisfied grin on his face. "So, this is the great Bediako," he said mockingly. "The man who thought he could defy kings and empires. Look at you now, powerless, weak. You will regret the day you were born." The Portuguese governor sat in his lavish quarters, devising his next move. Bediako, the legendary warrior who had defied kings and empires, was now powerless and in chains. The governor knew that simply killing him would not suffice. He saw Bediako as more than a warrior. He was a genetic anomaly, a man of extraordinary strength and resilience. "We will take him to Europe," the governor declared to his advisors, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "He will not only serve as a slave, but also as a breeding tool. His offspring will inherit his strength, and Europe will gain a lineage of men and women as strong as lions. Let him curse the day he was born, as we break him in both body and spirit." The plan was set. Bediako, once a symbol of resistance and hope, was to be shipped across the seas, his bloodline exploited for the gain of his oppressors. But before the journey to Europe, the governor made sure to break him completely. Bediako was shackled and forced to endure grueling labor. The mighty warrior was now reduced to a beast of burden. His chains clinked with every step as he was made to pull carts laden with heavy farming equipment, work traditionally done by oxen and horses. His once proud dreadlocks, the symbol of his divine strength, were gone, and his body bore the scars of frequent whippings by Portuguese overseers. Under the blazing sun, Bediako labored in silence, his hands rough and calloused from ploughing the fields and hauling goods. Each lash of the whip against his back was a reminder of the betrayal that had brought him here. Yet he refused to cry out. His spirit remained unbroken, though his body endured unspeakable suffering. When Nana Koduah heard the news of Bediako's capture, he could hardly contain his glee. "Finally!" he roared in triumph, raising a goblet of palm wine. "The lion of Asomjwe Kuro has been caged. The gods have shown me favor once again." He ordered a feast to celebrate the downfall of his greatest enemy. Messengers spread the news across his kingdom, and the people, fearful of his wrath, joined the celebrations. But in secret, many mourned Bediako, knowing he had been a savior to so many. Nana Koduah also used the opportunity to reward Munumkum's family. He saw their betrayal of Bediako as a critical piece of his victory and decided to solidify their loyalty. Traveling with his warriors to Nyamikrom, he stormed the palace and killed the reigning king, declaring the throne vacant. "In recognition of your loyalty," Nana Koduah proclaimed to Munumkum's family, "I bestow the throne of Nyamikrom upon you. May your reign honor my name and our alliance." The family rejoiced, hailing Munumkum as the reason for their rise to power. Songs were sung in her honor, and her name was praised throughout the land. Yet, despite the celebration, Munumkum's heart grew heavier with each passing day. As the new queen of Nyamikrom, Munumkum received an invitation to visit the Portuguese governor at his castle. It was an opportunity to solidify her relationship with the Europeans and bask in her newfound status. She dressed in her finest attire, adorned with gold and beads, and made the journey to the grand castle. But as she arrived, her heart sank. The sight before her was one she would never forget. In the courtyard, under the scorching sun, she saw him, Bediako. He was shirtless, his body glistening with sweat, his hands and feet bound in heavy iron shackles. His once proud demeanor was gone, replaced by a haunting silence as he pulled a massive cart laden with sacks of grain. A Portuguese overseer stood nearby, whip in hand. When Bediako slowed under the unbearable weight, the overseer lashed his back mercilessly. Munumkum's eyes filled with tears as she watched the man she once loved, who had moved mountains for his people, reduced to a shadow of himself. Munumkum's chest tightened with guilt and despair. The man she had betrayed out of greed and ambition was now enduring unimaginable suffering. She remembered the times he had fought for justice, his unwavering strength, and his love for her. But now he was a prisoner, stripped of his power because of her betrayal. Her knees felt weak as she whispered to herself, "What have I done? This is my doing." As Bediako continued his labor, his gaze briefly met Munumkum's. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, unspoken sadness. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. In that moment, Munumkum remembered the advice Bediako's father had given him, the warning to never trust her. Munumkum bit her lip, trying to hold back her tears. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a boulder. She wanted to approach him, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew it was too late. The damage had been done. As the overseer barked orders and cracked the whip again, Bediako straightened his back. Though his body was broken, his spirit remained strong. He looked up at the sky, silently calling upon the gods. "I may be in chains," he thought, "but my soul is free. The gods are not finished with me yet." Munumkum turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. She left the castle that day, her heart heavy with regret. Though she wore the crown of Nyamikrom and enjoyed the luxuries of her new status, her spirit was tormented by the betrayal that had led to Bediako's suffering. The grand feast was announced, a celebration of Munumkum's critical role in capturing Bediako. The Portuguese governor, his officials, Nana Koduah, and the elders of his kingdom were all invited to the grand castle to mark the occasion. Munumkum, who had been named the Queen Mother of Nyamikrom after her family's ascension to the throne, was given the honor of serving the feast. Her role was seen as a gesture of loyalty to the Portuguese and Nana Koduah. But deep within, Munumkum was tormented by guilt and shame. She could no longer live with the betrayal she had committed against Bediako, the man she had once loved. The sight of him in chains, broken and powerless because of her actions, haunted her day and night. She had destroyed not just his life, but her own soul. In a moment of resolve, she decided to take matters into her own hands and end the tyranny of Nana Koduah and the Portuguese, even if it meant her own life. On the day of the feast, Munumkum personally prepared the food and drinks, ensuring that every cup of wine and every dish was laced with a deadly poison. She carried the trays herself, serving the Portuguese governor, his officials, Nana Koduah, and the elders with a smile masking her inner turmoil. "To honor you all," she said softly, raising her own goblet, "I toast to peace, power, and the future." As they drank and feasted, the poison began to take effect. One by one, the Portuguese officials and Nana Koduah clutched their chests, gasping for air. Chaos erupted as the room filled with coughing, choking, and screams. Nana Koduah, realizing what had happened, turned his dying gaze to Munumkum, who stood silently, tears streaming down her face. "You!" he croaked, falling to the ground. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your tyranny ends here." Munumkum drank the poisoned wine herself, collapsing beside the bodies of her victims. As her vision faded, she murmured, "Bediako, forgive me." In one tragic moment, the lives of Nana Koduah, Munumkum, and the Portuguese leaders ended, leaving the region in disarray. 5 months after the feast, the Portuguese decided to transport Bediako and hundreds of other enslaved men, women and children to Europe. By this time, Bediako had regrown his hair, though it was not as long as before. His strength, however, was returning, and he bided his time, pretending to remain broken while planning his escape. The slaves were herded onto a massive ship, their chains clanking as they were forced into the dark, cramped hold. Bediako looked around at the despairing faces of his fellow captives, his resolve hardening. He whispered to himself, "The gods are with me. This will not be our end." As the ship began to prepare for its journey, Bediako summoned his strength. With a deep breath, he tore the chains binding his wrists, the metal snapping like brittle wood. The sound startled the nearby guards, who rushed toward him. Bediako roared like a lion, his voice shaking the ship. The battle erupted in the ship's hold. Using his broken chains as weapons, Bediako swung them with deadly precision, knocking out guards with a single blow. The slaves, inspired by his courage, began to rise, using anything they could find, chains, boards, even their bare hands, to fight back. The Portuguese soldiers fired their muskets, but the tight quarters and chaos made it difficult to aim. Bediako moved like a shadow, dodging bullets and appearing behind his enemies with lightning speed. He grabbed a musket from one soldier and used it to strike down others, his strength unmatched. The captain of the ship, hearing the commotion, descended into the hold with reinforcements. "Stop him!" he shouted, drawing his sword. But Bediako was unstoppable. He charged at the soldiers, using his fists, legs, and even the chains of other slaves to fight. His skin, toughened by the gods, resisted blades and blows as if it were made of steel. Each swing of his arm sent soldiers flying, their cries drowned out by the chaos. The freed slaves cheered him on. "Bediako! Bediako!" they shouted, their voices filled with hope. He was their hero, their savior, and their symbol of resistance. As the battle raged on, Bediako reached the captain. The man swung his sword, but Bediako caught it with his bare hands, snapping the blade in two. With one powerful strike, he sent the captain crashing into a wall, ending his reign over the ship. Bediako and the freed slaves fought their way to the deck, overpowering the remaining guards. Victory seemed within reach, but one wounded Portuguese soldier, realizing all was lost, set fire to the ship's gunpowder store. The explosion shook the vessel, flames quickly spreading throughout the decks. "Everyone off the ship!" Bediako shouted, breaking the chains of the last remaining slaves. He helped them jump into the water, ensuring no one was left behind. But as the fire consumed the ship, Bediako found himself trapped. The flames licked at his feet, and the smoke filled his lungs. He looked to the horizon, his thoughts turning to his people, his village, and the love that had betrayed him. With one final roar, Bediako fell to his knees as the flames engulfed him. The ship burned to ashes, taking with it the man who had become a legend. Bediako's story is a powerful reminder of how love, trust, and betrayal can shape our lives. Love, though beautiful, can sometimes blind us to the truth. Bediako's love for Munumkum made him vulnerable, allowing her to exploit his trust and bring about his downfall. This tale also teaches us about the dangers of greed and ambition. Munumkum's desire for power turned her against the man who loved her, leading to her ultimate regret and demise. Finally, Bediako's journey is a warning about the importance of keeping your secrets. Trusting the wrong person with your secrets can turn them into weapons against you. As the Akan saying goes, Aboa bibeka wana ofiri wo antoma mu. The ant that bites you hides in your own cloth. Remember, a secret shared is no longer a secret. If you can't keep it to yourself, don't expect anyone else to keep it for you. And when love blinds you, remember that trust must be earned, not given freely. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to Anansi Web of Tales. Share your thoughts in the comments, let us know where you're watching from, and like this video to encourage us to create more stories. Thank you for always supporting us. And remember, your secret is your power.